Dr. Richard, we're going to do an hour here on economics and do it seriously and do it rationally and do it thoughtfully and insightfully and all that stuff. Dr. Richard Wolff is on the line with us. He's an economist. He's professor emeritus of economics at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, visiting professor in the graduate program for international affairs at the New School University in New York City, and author of numerous books, including his latest, Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism. Dr. Wolff, welcome to our program.
Thank you very much, Tom. I'm glad to be here.
I'm very pleased to have you with us. And did by the way, since you're going to be with us through the whole hour, did our call screener explain to you that when the music starts, we've got to wrap up and there's hard breaks and all that kind of stuff?
Yes, they did.
Okay, great. So you've got the whole shtick here.
Yeah.
Great. I'm curious. We've talked a lot about this on the TV program, but not so much on radio. What do you see as the biggest economic problem right now facing the United States or facing the United States and the world?
Well, I think that we've come to a bit of a crossroads in the American economy. We have had an economic system that worked really pretty well for about 100 years, from the 1850s to the 1970s. All things considered, it had many bumps, and the big one in the Great Depression. But even across the Depression, the wages of American workers steadily rose. That stopped in the 1970s as American employers found cheaper workers elsewhere in the world, and they didn't need the American working class the way they had before. Wages stopped rising in the 1970s, real wages, and they never resumed. And what happened was that the American working class was told that if they wanted to enjoy the American dream, they'd have to borrow money like it has never been done before, which they did. But in the end, you cannot keep borrowing on a basically flat wage because you will be unable to, in the end, pay those debts or cover the interest. And in 2007, this kind of system broke down. And it didn't just break down in a short-term business cycle the way Presidents Bush and Obama had said it would and had hoped it would. It showed us this long-term change in America in which a decision based on profits by our business leaders is now showing us the long-term consequences, and it's a question of economic decline. So to answer your question, I think the question is whether the American people, the vast majority, are ready to accept a long-term slide in their standards of living, what they can afford, what they can give their kids, or whether they're going to say, no, there has to be a change in an economic system that works this way. And I think that's the big issue that is being faced. Across Europe today, there are demonstrations by the millions in every major European city on just this question. And I think it's only a matter of time before that question impresses itself on the American people in a way that will confront us all with very basic decisions.
Would it be reasonable to say that what we're seeing is the a clash of economic worldviews between that of Galbraith and Keynes versus that of Milton Friedman and Ayn Rand?
I think that's one of them, but I actually think it's a kind of a multiple set of confrontations. Yes, that one which says that the way you deal with an economic crisis is you crunch down on the economy, you take the society over a fiscal cliff, to use the phrase we're talking about in our country. You impose austerity, which is the way they say it in Europe, versus the Keynesians or the Galbraithians who say, no, the time of crisis is when you pump money to the mass of people and you build up the economy from below. But at the same time, there is an even more fundamental question, which is whether a system of economics that puts the decisive power in the hands basically of a tiny minority, the major shareholders, the boards of directors of the 500 largest corporations in the United States, they make all the key economic decisions, what to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits. Are we as a nation, this other question and confrontation says, are we as a nation willing to continue leaving all that economic power, all that economic discretion in the hands of that minority, the 1%, especially now, given that we're entering the 6th year of an economic downturn that has cost so many people their jobs, their homes, their job security, and so on. So I think there are multiple profound questions agitating the underlying reality of America today.
Well, and perhaps there's a larger frame that we can put around this. In the game of Monopoly, which is kind of what these 500 corporations you're talking about are playing, in the game of Monopoly, when you end up owning all of the properties, the other players no longer have the ability to earn income from their rents, if we want to get it to Henry George here, and as a consequence of that, they're broke. You know, you got one left standing, but even that one left standing, the game ends. It's not like, at the end of a Monopoly game, I mean, the person ends up with all the money, but the game ends. Are we looking at a game end? Are we looking at a great crash if we don't do something about this?
Well, I'm not given to that way of thinking, so perhaps there's some meaning when I answer your question. Yes, I think we may well be at a point in the economic development of modern capitalism where it has painted itself into a corner, where it really has to discover yet again that if you do exactly as you say, Tom, if you bankrupt everybody else, in the end, you will destroy yourself as well. It's sort of the old story that we tell children about the Midas touch, about the greedy king who wanted everything he touched to turn to gold. And then he finally, embraced his beloved daughter, and she wasn't the real person anymore because she had changed into gold too. Right. The Germans, for example, are learning that if you bankrupt the rest of Europe, and yet you have to sell to the rest of Europe to survive, it's going to eventually strangle your own economy. Mm-hmm. And we're discovering in the United States that if you impoverish the mass of people bit by bit, year by year, in the end, they won't be able to be the consumers you as a businessman or woman need them to be if you're going to survive yourself. But that's when we look back on all the other empires in the world, the British Empire, the Roman Empire, the Greek Empire, the Chinese empires, we all wonder when we look back at them, why didn't they take the steps that seem obvious to us that might have avoided the end, the collapse of their empires? And I have to wonder with you whether we are not at that kind of moment in the United States where we seem like deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming car, unable to see that we must break out of an existing system or its decline is going to take us with it.
Right. So we have just a minute to a very, very brief break, but what do we do?
Well, I've been thinking about that for some years. The book you kindly mentioned at the beginning, Democracy at Work, mm-hmm. I think the answer is we finally have to do what I like to call completing the democratic revolution, not limiting democracy to just where we live and to our politics, but bringing it, if we really believe in it, as I do, bringing it into the economy too. And if the people who make up an enterprise are 5,000 strong, then democracy means we all together in that enterprise make its basic decisions. We don't leave them to a tiny minority of boards of directors and major shareholders. They had their chance. They built up the economic system, but it's no longer working. And maybe if we introduce democracy to the economy, we can have the kind of rebirth of our societies that we achieved when we brought democracy instead of autocracy into our political life.
Okay, and we'll get into more detail in just a few minutes about how we do that. It's our Conversations with Great Minds hour here on the Thom Hartmann Program with Dr. Richard Wolff. His website, by the way, rdwolff with 2fs.com.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And Dr. Wolff, also his most recent book, Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism. Check it out. We'll be right back with Dr. Wolff in just a second. And welcome back. Dr. Wolff, you still with us?
I am.
Okay. Our commercial radio stations, maybe half of our audience has gone to a commercial break, but our non-commercial stations, our Pacific affiliates all over the country, and our viewers on Free Speech TV, on Dish and Direct and cable systems all over the country are still with us, several million people. So I'd like to continue the conversation, but let's keep in mind that if anything critical gets said, we may have to repeat it after the break, okay?
Okay.
So we're talking about how we fix the American economy. Well, actually, if I could dial back, you said this all started in the late 70s. I like to blame everything on Ronald Reagan, but he wasn't in power in the late 70s. Jimmy Carter really started drinking that deregulation Kool-Aid in the last 2 years of his administration. Was it that? Was that the point at which, I mean, what was when did the dial get turned? When did the decision get made? Is there any event that you can point to?
Well, it's really a decade. It's the decade of the 1970s. And it's that decade because a number of forces and tendencies and processes in our history came together. You know, these big turning points are never reducible to one or another cause. It's always when a whole variety of things kind of come together in a certain way. So let me mention what happened in the 70s that changed everything. And I begin with wages because I think that's the key thing. The United States, since its founding as an independent country back in the 18th century, was a place that had a labor shortage. You know, the Europeans who came here did away with the Native Americans, and so even though they had wonderful land and they had wonderful oceans and great climate and a productive soil, they always were good at business, but they kept running out against a shortage of human beings to do the work, which is why we're a nation of immigrants. We only solved that problem by bringing Africans here against their will and inducing most of the white people from Europe to come here by offering rising wages so that they would have an incentive to leave Europe and come here in the hope of a better life. No sooner did they get here, of course, than they had a new choice between staying on the East Coast, where they usually arrived, or moving into the interior, where there was very cheap land available for them. So employers in the East and then later in the Midwest knew that they had to keep raising wages to bring people from Europe, and then they had to keep raising wages to keep those people from going to the Midwest and becoming farmers. And so we had, from the early 19th century right up to the 1970s, a stunning reality. Real wages, that is the amount of money a worker got adjusted for the prices he or she had to pay, kept rising for 150 years nearly. And no other capitalist country ever did that. We provided our workers with a rising standard of living, which they believed had something to do especially with the United States. The truth of it was closer to the fact that we had a perpetual labor shortage and that raising wages was the only way businesses could cope. Having said that, in the 1970s, all that changed. And there were basically four things that happened that changed everything. Number one, I mentioned, businesses leaving the United States precisely because wages had risen so high here in order to go to India, China, Latin America, or anywhere in the world where they could get cheaper labor.
Okay, let's pick up the other three right after this break. We're talking with Dr. Richard Wolff. He is the author of his most recent book, Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism, rdwolff, WOLFF.com, his website. We'll be right back. Welcome back to our Conversations with Great Minds. Today, Dr. Richard Wolff for the hour, professor of economics, professor emeritus of economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, visiting professor of the Graduate Program for International Affairs at the New School University of New York City, author of numerous books, including his latest brilliant work, Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism. His website, rdwolff with two Fs.com. Professor Wolff, you were if I can just very quickly summarize and correct me if I make any mistakes here, that the United States, uniquely among many democracies around the world, had basically a labor shortage from more or less our founding up until the 1970s, and which is why there's all these immigrants here. You know, people came from all over the world because there was a labor shortage, and employers were competing for labor, and so wages were continuously rising, and thus, you know, we had this steadily growing middle class. And all that came to a screeching halt in the 1970s, and you said that there are 4 reasons why. First of all, did I get everything right? And secondly, you want to get into those 4 reasons.
Yep, you got it perfectly right. So we have to explain what happened in the 1970s to basically end the labor shortage. And by ending the labor shortage, the message was sent to every employer, you don't have to raise wages anymore because we have an excess of people, and everybody who works knows that if he or she pushes for higher wages, the employer can always go and find among those people that are now extra in the society substitutes for those who are dissatisfied. And so employers didn't have to raise wages anymore, and they haven't done so for the last 30 years. So what were the 4 reasons? Very quickly. Number 1, employers stopped hiring Americans. That is, huge numbers of them moved production out of the United States and reset up their factories, their offices, their stores in other countries. Wherever the labor was cheaper or cheapest, they would move. And that meant that the demand for workers here in the United States dropped. The second thing that happened in the 1970s was the beginning of a major wave of automation, of replacing American workers with the latest new technological breakthrough, namely the computer. Jobs that used to require 50 people could now be done by one person working in front of a computer terminal. So those 2 phenomena, moving jobs abroad and replacing workers with machines, drastically reduced the need for workers. And ironically, at the same time, 2 new groups of people added to the supply of people looking for jobs. The beginning of the mass movement of American adult women who wanted equal opportunity, who wanted jobs in the paid labor force, were no longer willing to be only homemakers, mothers, wives, and so on, meant that millions and millions of American women moved into the paid labor force. And finally, we had a new wave of immigration, not from Europe this time, mostly from Latin America, coming north into the United States looking for work. Well, if you put together the loss of job opportunities because of the movement of production out of the country and the replacement of workers with computers on the one hand, and the arrival of millions of women and new immigrants from Latin America on the other, you have what we economists call a decline in the demand for workers and a rise in the supply of people looking for work. That's a recipe for the end of rising wages.
All right, this is David Ricardo
That's
on
right.
labor.
It's not that complicated once you see what the basic movements here are.
Right.
And you know, what Americans could have and should have done in the 70s, but we didn't do as a nation, is face this reality. Say to ourselves, my goodness, our historic situation is changed. What are we going to do? Either the mass of people are going to have to do without the goods and services that define the American dream, or they're going to have to find another way to achieve them. The irony is we never had a conversation on the national level. None of our leaders either saw this or were willing to discuss it. So Americans took individual decisions. And what most of Americans did is 2 things. Work more hours to compensate for the fact that wages weren't going out, and send more members of the family out to work. And the second thing, the crucial thing, is to achieve the American dream by borrowing more and more money. Right. Borrow to buy your house, borrow to buy your car, borrow everything through a credit card, and the most recent stunning phenomena, go into the deepest debt imaginable to give your kids the education that the American dream always included. And by 2007, we had the end result. Americans had taken on more debt than their flat wages would allow them to pay. And now we're living with the consequences.
Now, Time magazine in the 1960s, I think it was 67, had a really interesting cover story about the coming leisure society. They pointed out that because of machinery, starting with Eli Whitney's cotton gin, and these incremental increases in productivity, that the American workers were now so much more. The consequence of increasing productivity per worker was a decreasing number of hours needed to work every week to get the same income. So we went from the 60 or 70-hour week, or arguably the 80 or 90-hour week back in the early 19th century, to the 60-hour week, to the 50-hour week at the beginning of the 20th century, to the 40-hour week. And they said that if this increase in productivity continues, we'll be at a 25-hour week, and people will have leisure because wages will remain the same. Now, I understand that if CEO pay and dividends had not gone up as much as they have since the 70s, that wages actually would have gone up or working hours could have gone down. Do I have that wrong?
No, you have it exactly right. And, it's a wonderful indictment of the capitalist system. We have become more productive. We have used the machines, including the computer, to make it possible for a single worker to produce more output today than he or she could 5 years ago, and that more than 10 years ago, and so on. And every increase in productivity should have made it possible, and the defenders of productivity have always said this, should have made it possible to do less labor and still get the same amount of output, thereby freeing human beings from the burden of work. But it's an indictment of capitalism that didn't work out that way, that Americans are in fact doing more hours of labor today than they did 5, 10, and 15 years ago. It has not only not freed us from labor, our growing productivity, but it's a peculiarity of our capitalist system that we are ending up doing more labor. Here's a statistic.
Remarkable. Hang on just a second. Dr. Wolff, we have to pick this up on the other side of the break.